For decades, Americans have tried to get control of the southern border. But no matter how hard they've tried, foreign invaders keep illegally surging into the country. Is there anything Americans can do to combat this southern invasion? To find the answer, we're going to tell the story of one man's journey to California and how in just 2 decades, he watched Los Angeles become the city of fallen angels. This is Red Pilled America. It was around 1990, and Reverend Jesse Lee Peterson was working to rebuild Los Angeles black families when something started to hit his radar. Blacks and Latinos were in conflict.
We noticed that a lot of illegals had started coming into the country.
That's Jesse.
And as a result, the blacks and the Hispanic were fighting in schools.
Students and police officers tell us that apparently the whole thing began last February when allegedly a group of Hispanic students walked out of a Black History Month assembly. Well, today it seems that a group of black students walked out of a Cinco de Mayo celebration.
Yes, we did walk out, but they don't want to hit us first.
Well, people were getting hit with bath bottles.
They just started saying black power, so they start hitting us, so we start hitting them back.
School officials canceled classes, dismissed students, and called Inglewood police. But the encounters continued outside, where even desperate parents looking for their children got caught in the middle.
Hey, why you fight? Because you black and I'm Mexican.
We had a meeting about it, that we was gonna walk out on them, on their Cinco de Mayo thing, so we did.
They talk about this is a black school, this is a black city, this is, our black neighborhood. It's not fair. We're Hispanics. We have a right to say whatever we want.
Besides Inglewood High School, racially motivated violence also broke out at Jordan High School and Manual Arts High.
By the early 1990s, tension had been brewing between blacks and Hispanics for well over a decade. Again, Jesse Lee Peterson.
They were holding the blacks back to try to teach the Hispanics who couldn't speak English and things like that. They were taking the jobs from the blacks, those low-paying jobs, low-wage jobs, and they were giving them to the Hispanic for cheap labor. And the so-called civil rights leaders and all those people were not doing anything about it.
That wasn't always the case in Los Angeles.
I remember when there was so few Hispanic here, it was amazing. When I first moved here, there were no homeless people that I remember seeing. There were businesses everywhere. There were no drug addicts all over the streets, and crime wasn't out of control.
His experience in California shows just how much the state has been transformed by illegal immigration. Reverend Jesse Lee Peterson isn't a Los Angeles native. He was raised in the 1950s South.
I grew up in Alabama on a plantation right outside of Montgomery. My parents and their parents and their parents and their parents worked the plantation. When I was growing up, my grandfather was the manager of it. He ran everything there. I lived in a tin-roof house, and the bathroom was, built outside of the house. So I grew up at a time when you would think that things was really bad for Black Americans, but they really were our best times because we had families, we had parents and grandparents, and our parents did not hate anyone or blame anyone. We took responsibility for ourselves. They treated everyone the way that they would like to be treated, never mind the color. And we knew that the Jim Crow law, which was talked about rarely, but we knew it was organized by the Democrats, and they didn't want black people in the Democratic Party at the time. And so we knew all that, but we also knew that all white people wasn't for that. They were not for the Jim Crow law. And so we treated people the way we would like to be treated. I remember for colors only signs, for whites only signs, but it was just the way it was. It didn't stop us from moving forward in life. Our parents believed in God. Unlike the blacks today, they don't believe in God. They believe in color.
Jesse struggled in school and was at the bottom of his class, but his family instilled a work ethic in him.
I worked the plantation. The boys would be taken out of school to plant the crop, and then when it's time to harvest, to bring it in, we were taken out to bring it in. I remember my grandparents telling me and my brothers and sisters and others, we're gonna help you, we're gonna raise you, but at 18, you're out of here. You gotta go.
So when he wasn't in school, he was always looking to work. In the summer after his 11th grade year, his uncle from California gave him a call.
And he invited me out one summer to babysit for them. They're like, can you come out and babysit it for us? I'm like, yeah. When I walked off the airplane in Los Angeles, I knew this is where I would live. It was like the palm trees, the weather, it was like paradise.
So he went back to Alabama with a purpose. He squeaked by and graduated high school, then went to Indiana to work just enough to buy a ticket to California. In 1968, at the age of 18, he moved to Southern California.
When I first moved to LA, it was like moving into paradise. It was so beautiful out here. I loved LA because it was a land of opportunities.
Jesse first moved into his aunt and uncle's house in South Central.
I remember when I first moved into that area, it was mixed with blacks and whites. A lot of white folks were still there. And it was beautiful, the houses were beautiful, and people walking the streets and not afraid because there were no gangs and things like that at the time. So you were not afraid to walk the streets.
He applied for a job at a local supermarket in South Central.
I got a job just like that because there were plenty of jobs at the time. And I started out as a box boy at the supermarket. Then I moved into the produce department because you can make more money there. And from there, I became a cashier. You can make even more money in the cashier department. So I just worked my way up. And from there, I left and went to another company, Sears, and I started making more money there. But I loved the fact that the opportunities were here at the time in California. The people were friendlier at the time as well, because from what I can tell, black people and white people got along during that time. I know they did in my uncle and aunt's neighborhood. We were friendly with the white folks in the neighborhood, South Central.
But trouble was quietly brewing.
Number one is the so-called civil rights movement that Martin Luther King started. That should have never happened because it separated the people, and the so-called civil rights leader took over the minds of black people and started making them feel like they were victims. And so most blacks, not all, but most blacks stopped thinking for themselves as they turned their lives over to the so-called civil rights leaders, Jesse Jackson and all those guys. And so they sold the blacks to the Democratic Party for free money, welfare, and all that. And the civil rights people wanted power and wealth for themselves. So they started pushing this idea about racism, white people hate black folks and all that, and the blacks fell for it. I remember things changing when that happened.
At the same time that tensions between blacks and whites began to grow in the early 70s, another phenomenon was impacting the black community.
You started to have more out-of-wedlock birth, because when I was growing up, it was less than 10% of black babies born out of wedlock. But when the civil rights leaders sold the blacks to the government and these women started getting welfare checks and things like that, they stopped getting married. They started to have babies just to be on welfare, because the more children you had, the more money you would get. And so they started having babies out of wedlock, no more father and mother together. They started brainwashing the kids about racism in the schools. And it just, one thing led to another. And they noticed that white people were not speaking out against it. And it just made it worse. They were trying to appease the blacks. It just got worse and worse and worse.
With tensions high, whites began moving out of South Central and its neighboring cities in a process that would later be called white flight.
Eventually, white people moved away, and then the riffraffs came in with the gang violence and all that stuff.
Just as this social shift was occurring, the Los Angeles black community was hit by another development: illegal immigration.
They were giving the illegals free education and free health care and free housing, while the citizens were suffering, and especially the black citizens.
He began to notice how Los Angeles blacks were losing jobs to illegal aliens.
It got so bad that the blacks in East LA and South Central LA were leaving their own communities and moving back to the South and other places because their leaders were not doing anything about it.
Over the next 2 decades, illegal immigration would only get worse in America, especially in California. In 1970, the state was 78% white and 12% Hispanic. In July 2014, for the first time, Latinos surpassed whites in the Golden State, and their numbers have only been increasing.
What can patriotic Americans do to combat illegal immigration? The answer is breed. Americans have exhausted every possible political remedy to stop the invasion of our southern border. We've passed ballot initiatives, elected congressmen, senators, and governors who've promised to stop illegal immigration. We put a man in the White House who floated ending birthright citizenship and promised to build a wall. Activists like Jesse Lee Peterson have courageously tried everything, but all these efforts have only increased illegal immigration, and there appears to be no end in sight. The only new thing left to do is to follow some of the oldest and wisest words ever written: be fruitful and multiply. This may be a hard thing to hear, but illegal aliens have won the battle. Our leaders will not control our borders, so we have entered a numbers game. We must breed more. We're not saying that we shouldn't fight every attempt at amnesty. We're not saying we shouldn't vote out every open borders politician. That work must continue, but it appears that the only way to win the war against illegal immigration in the long run is to be fruitful and multiply. Because now that California is lost for the foreseeable future, Texas appears to be the next target. And these people, they mean business.